Good evening, everyone. I'm Natalye, Appel, board member of Friends of Fondren Library, Rice grad, parent, love it register, etc., and an architect who really loves books. So I'm especially thrilled to welcome all of you here today to hear this fabulous talk by Dr. Gökçe Günel. There are also several Friends of Fondren board members here today, and I'd especially like to recognize my colleagues, Victor Benavides and Julie Gianelloni Connor, who helped to arrange this event tonight. Professor Günel received her PhD in Anthropology at Cornell, BA and Master's at Koç University in Istanbul, and began teaching in 2019 at Rice, following different positions on the faculties of Columbia and University of Arizona. Her areas of focus include social cultural anthropology, energy, and climate change in the Middle East and Africa. And her incredibly fascinating book, Spaceship in the Desert, has entranced a lot of us architects on the Rice campus. It's about energy, climate change, and urban design in Abu Dhabi. And she also co-edits an experimental journal that I was fascinated to hear about called LIM, which is a collaborative inquiry illuminating problems emerging at the interface of technology, politics, and contemporary life. And she's one of the leaders and co-authors of Patchwork Ethnography, a new methodological and theoretical approach to ethnographic research. And not to take any more of our 7 hours, but I'm really curious to hear if an affinity for a particular genre of fiction that Gökçe and I share has in any way shaped her amazing world. After the talk, we'll have a short Q&A and a reception. So please help me welcome Gökçe Günel.
Many thanks for inviting me to share some thoughts with you at the heart of our campus, the Fondren Library. So as Natalye kindly explained, I'm an associate professor of anthropology here, and this is the beginning of my 7th year as a faculty member. So as you might imagine, writing this talk has been very introspective and self-indulgent as an exercise. There are so many, and at the same time, so few books that fit this category. So in making the selection, I looked for books that induced a material shift in my life, along with some that gave me conceptual paths to pursue rather than putting together a list of favorites. I'm also happy to provide that if necessary. In the past few years, as part of the project that Natalye mentioned, Patchwork Ethnography, I've been conducting an exercise with colleagues and students where I asked them to describe their intellectual trajectories, considering the influence of personal as well as academic factors. So what are the circumstances that shaped how you got here, orienting you to ask these research questions? In some ways, I've taken this opportunity to answer that question for myself, and so pointing to some of the books that played critical roles. So as Natalye already described, the book that shaped my life the most is my own book, Spaceship in the Desert. The book broadly investigates how urban environments transform amid energy and climate change related pressures, and it explores the construction of an eco-city in Abu Dhabi called Masdar City. The process of writing the book introduced me to the particulars of ethnographic research as well as to the broader world of academic production. It allowed me to meet many friends and colleagues who share these interests. And it taught me that it takes me about a decade to write a book, and perhaps 2 or 3 times in my life I can muster the discipline and the patience to remain committed to a project for such a long stretch of time. And most importantly for our purposes here, Spaceship in the Desert gave me the opportunity to join Rice as a tenured professor. So in this talk, I'll use Spaceship in the Desert as a hinge and describe to you the steps that led me to the book. And maybe at the end, there'll be some time to talk about the last 10 years, though. So as many of you in the audience may already know or have already guessed, I was born in Turkey, and I learned how to read and write from my grandmother, who is a retired elementary school teacher, and you can see her here. This was my first day of school in 1988. Between ages 1 and 7, my grandparents raised me in a town called Mudanya and on the southern shore of the Marmara Sea. And as children of displaced people who had found themselves in this town due to the population exchange between Turkey and Greece in the 1920s, so this is soon after the establishment of nation states and in the wake of the Ottoman Empire's dissolution, my grandparents had shed all remnants of the Greek language to become good, solid Turks. Trained in teacher schools in different parts of Anatolia, they understood themselves as the first generation of modern secular citizens in the country. And reading was critical to that identity. And this is, you can see my grandparents here. This is my 3rd birthday, and that's my great-grandmother. So as a child, I mostly entertained myself by reading, and because my mother is a very nostalgic person who enjoys keeping things, but let's not call her a hoarder, she's very orderly, I can still show you a photograph of some of my favorites from early childhood years. These books taught me that an imaginative inner world is one of the best resources a person can create for themselves. So for instance, the books you see here titled Ayşegül were translations of the Belgian book series Martin, published in the 1950s and 1960s, and centered on a young girl. Each book presented her in a new setting or activity, riding a bicycle or going to the beach. Other books gave voice to animals or furniture or built whole worlds around these nonverbal participants to everyday life. But unfortunately, I won't include these early childhood stories here as the books that changed my life. As an elementary school student preparing for a highly competitive national high school entrance exam and now living with my parents and my newborn sister in a larger city near Mudanya called Bursa, the books that shaped my life the most significantly were not the Pıtırcık stories, or as they're known in English, the Little Nicola books, which I adored, but these dull, colorless books that contain multiple choice questions. While the humorous Little Nicola books described inventive French children who misunderstood the many erratic behaviors of adults and in response formed their own worlds full of adventures, the multiple choice questions exemplified a total submission to adult activity. Stacked horizontally under the blackboard in our classroom, the books containing multiple choice exam questions in all fields were distributed to the 224 students from my school who prepared in unison for that year's entrance exam. Since you've made the mistake of giving me a platform where I can brag about early childhood, something that I don't often have access to, especially not in a professional context, I can tell you that I was very good at solving these tests. Perhaps even a little too good, because I scored the top score in that national high school exam in 1993. So I was 10 years old. So beyond letting me become a national celebrity during the few summer days in 1993 when the exam results were announced, this top score allowed me to enroll at Robert College in Istanbul, an American school that was founded in 1863 as part of the first wave of American efforts to establish higher education institutions in the Middle East, along with the American University in Beirut and the American University in Cairo. The modernizing Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century Ottoman Empire had created a context where various Western powers sponsored higher education, competing for smart students. Initially established as Protestant missionary schools, these American institutions did not really feel religious, but they inserted the US into the region's social and intellectual life many decades before the US emerged as an imperial power. By 1993, it was well known that Robert College was a good school with many successful alumni. More important for my purposes, however, was that Robert College accepted boarding students because my family did not live in Istanbul. And here you can see my parents and my little sister celebrating the news with me and saying that they're very surprised at the news. So Robert College is where I learned to speak English and why I have the capacity to address you in this room today. So as many of my friends know, the next 7 years in the dorm were some of the most formative years of my life. So in the US, people often think that boarding schools are for wealthy, troubled kids with neglectful families. But here I'll claim that this is not always the case. As children who had spent every minute of the past 2 years solving multiple choice exam questions, my roommates and I were escapists. And even though its gates were locked and shut for 12 hours each day, the dormitory building enabled that escape. And this is, here you can see me on my first day at the dorm. A novel which all 10 of us read together in our first year as boarding students in 1994 offered such vivid descriptions of life at a boarding school that we began to fashion ourselves as fictional characters. Authored by an American man called Vincent Ewing, Genç Kızlar, meaning young girls in Turkish, was about 3 boarding students who fell in love with the same teacher. Some of the experiences represented in the book seemed so familiar. We were convinced that the author had spent some time on our campus, lying on the grass and watching the wonderful view of the Bosphorus. And at the same time, so extraordinary, the book depicted all these erotic scenes taking place on our campus, which to us as 11-year-olds seemed completely enigmatic and unimaginable. Still, we believed that there had to be a connection. Maybe Vincent Ewing had taught English to previous generations of Robert College students. In the back of the book, a note said that Ewing was the son of a famous stockbroker called Wendig Ewing. The experience was instructive on many fronts. For one, it proved how novels could center on what many outside the dorm would have considered utterly unimportant, while rendering the issues that already found significant media attention in the period, such as the unexpected election of Recep Tayyip Erdogan, so Turkey's current president, as Istanbul's mayor, and therefore his arrival onto the national political scene, marginal. And perhaps more importantly, sharing the representations of such utterly unimportant experiences created a bond between us, all awkward and overachieving children with different backgrounds and from across the country, and made us into a community, only a slightly more mature version of the students that I loved in those little Nicola books. What makes this story extremely satisfying and worth sharing during this lecture is that a decade later, our suspicions were confirmed. In 2003, a well-known translator, Nihal Yeinobalı, who herself had lived in that same dormitory in the 1940s, exactly 50 years before we read this book, published Genç Kızlar under her own name. In 1950, a 23-year-old Nihal had told the publisher for whom she translated books that she wanted to write her own novel. When the publisher did not take her seriously, she shared the manuscript that she had feverishly composed while spending the month of Ramadan at her parents' house in Manisa, and informed the publisher that she had translated an older American novel that no longer required copyright, a book by Vincent Ewing, son of a famous stockbroker. As a pseudo-translation, perhaps Genç Kızlar allowed Nihal a kind of freedom, letting her include all this erotic content that we found so extraordinary. At the same time, it capitalized on the belief that translations from English sold better in Turkey than novels by Turkish authors. As soon as it was out, Genç Kızlar spread like wildfire, becoming a bestseller and preventing young Nihal from revealing her secret for half a century. Once I became fluent in English and with the understanding that I would not have to take another national entrance exam for several years, my interest in literature continued to grow. One book that I read together with my good friend Zeynep, who wanted to be a novelist, was Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red, published in 1998, introducing us to the main tenets of postmodernism, where reality becomes fragmented and destabilized. A historical novel that was set in late 16th century Istanbul during the height of the Ottoman Empire, the book starts with a dead man addressing the reader from the bottom of a well. In addition to centering questions of representation stylistically, the text had all the necessary parts to teach us about Orientalism and its critiques. This was not Orhan Pamuk's first book and not necessarily his best, but it happened to be published just at the right time when we were about to turn 15 and when we had started looking down on bestsellers like Genç Kızlar. This was also the year when we read William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury, completely falling in love with the novel's central character, Quentin Compson, and starting to imitate the stream of consciousness writing that we observed in Faulkner's novels in our very secret diaries. It's too sad that the same verticality we encountered at the beginning of Orhan Pamuk's My Name is Red was revealed to us at the end of The Sound and the Fury, with Quentin speaking to his audience as he prepared to commit suicide and descend deep into the Charles River. Zeynep and I have continued reading novels together for the past 30 years. Recently, we admired Mohammed Sar's The Most Secret Memory of Man and Susie Boyd's Loved and Missed. Some of my colleagues at Rice, for instance, my department chair, Jeff Fleischer, will know that I would read a novel only for the experience of sharing it with another reader. And I'm not sure if Jeff is aware, but this is why I mainly read that second on the calculation of volume book in late July. This is how I also almost destroyed my colleague Simone Howe's various communication channels. Her daughter, Brigitte, was convinced that the links to a novel called Vladimir, which I shared with her mainly because it describes a dysfunctional academic department, were coming from Russian scammers, and therefore wished to protect Simone by deleting all her accounts. And here's the cover of Vladimir, which might explain why Brigitte was concerned. Even though those 7 years in the dorm gave me a break from multiple choice exam questions, I knew that they would re-emerge on the horizon when I started preparing for the National University entrance exam. As a teenager, I'd learned from Hermann Hesse's famous Bildungsroman, Damien, that knowing yourself was the fundamental task of human life. Damien was published in 1919, right after the First World War, and was part of a literary trend that questioned how an individual should relate to broader social expectations and standards. It depicted estrangements from society by investigating its characters' quest for self-knowledge. And you can see here how I underlined the sentiment here, and in English the quote says, "Everyone had only one true vocation, to find themselves. Let them wind up as a poet or as a madman, as a prophet or a criminal. That wasn't their business. In the long run, it was irrelevant. Their business was to discover their own destiny, not just any destiny, and to live it totally and undividedly. Anything else was just a half measure, an attempt to run away, an escape back to the ideal of the masses, an adaptation, fear of one's own nature." Reading it now, it sounds really stark and predetermined. And I should thank my parents for keeping the book and my mother for scanning it for me as I prepared for this lecture. I somehow loved Damien. As a teenager living in a building with 70 other girls, I believed that I lacked the ease and comfort with which others approach the world, and imagined that this feeling could be remedied. Yet regardless of all this interest in finding myself, I didn't feel close to knowing anything about anything. I lacked the wisdom that our students at Rice so effortlessly embody, and I had no idea about what to do with my life. So this condition led me down what everyone in neoliberal Turkey considered the most productive path forward. As an undergraduate, I became a student in a business school. Neoliberal reforms in the 1980s had led to an expansion of private universities in the country, with strong business schools modeled after American universities, such as Koç University, where I was a student. These schools adopted curricula emphasizing finance, accounting, and marketing, and taught in English with US-trained faculty. And they produced alumni who could be employed at multinational corporations, banks, or various consultancies. After living a shared daydream with my boarding school friends for 7 years, I found myself in a very matter-of-fact place that enabled Turkey's integration into global capitalism by teaching us financial accounting. My fascination with literature had shown me that if I wished to make any claims or assertions about a person's decisions, I had to try and understand how the world appeared from that person's perspective. Even though it's at times far-fetched, this task becomes more possible with the help of some information and some imagination. But in a business school, unfortunately, there's only one type of person, the shareholder. Luckily for me, Koç University had adopted a liberal arts model, allowing business school students to explore the social sciences and the humanities more broadly. In a social anthropology class taught by Deniz Yükseker, I encountered ethnographic writing. Reading urban studies scholar Teresa Caldera's City of Walls for the first time in 2001, I came to the realization that the spaces I inhabited were imbued with social and political meaning. This book, which I still teach in my courses here at Rice, and which I just taught yesterday actually, documents the proliferation of gated communities, high walls, and private security systems in Sao Paulo in the 1980s and 1990s. Such urban transformations fostered segregation, allowing the middle classes to retreat into seemingly safe and protected spaces, while leaving the working classes marginalized. One of the most interesting points the book made was about how elites had withdrawn to private enclaves to resist the broader patterns of democratization in Brazil after decades of military rule. At this point, I'd spent more than half of my life living in dormitories, and I believed that there was something really exciting and reassuring about total institutions. But here was another take on what segregation did to people's understanding of themselves. In the context of Istanbul in the early 2000s, the book made so much sense. On August 17, 1999, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of copper pots falling onto my uncle's marble floor in Istanbul, and I hid under a doorframe throughout the earthquake's 45-second duration. Now we all know that it's a bad idea to run to a doorframe during an earthquake, but I had internalized that outdated myth, and I was lucky that our building did not collapse. Regardless, August 1999 was a transformative month. It legitimized and accelerated the middle-class demand for housing, which real estate developers packaged as luxurious gated communities built on cheap land and in the urban periphery. Like the people Caldera had analyzed in Brazil, this middle-class population demonized the newer waves of immigrants to the city, mainly Kurdish people who had been displaced due to political violence throughout the 1980s and 1990s. The earthquake gave real estate development a moral and ethical purpose. In addition to being a highly profitable venture, construction promised to ensure protection from future disasters. The gated Koç University campus, where I lived and studied, was situated amid Istanbul's northern forests and had also been designed and built during the same period. Perhaps such urban transformation was a canary in the coal mine. It normalized surveillance and exclusion, fragmented the public, depoliticized the middle classes, and strengthened the construction industry, possibly facilitating the authoritarian turn that would emerge in the country. So even though I had been aspiring for self-knowledge for several years at this point, when I graduated from business school in 2004, I still didn't know what to do with my life. A program that allowed recent graduates to find positions outside the country placed me in a microfinance agency in Jaipur, India, mostly randomly. Arriving in Jaipur, I was initially stunned by the accessibility of fiction and non-fiction books in English, because most of what I had read in Istanbul had been either pirated books or photocopies of volumes from the library. In Jaipur, I picked up copies of Khushwant Singh's Train to Pakistan, R.K. Narayan's The Guide, Anita Desai's Fire on the Mountain, amongst many others, and used India's wonderful book mail services to ship boxes of volumes to Istanbul. Some of you in the room may remember how widely celebrated microfinance programs were in the early 2000s, championed as tools for poverty alleviation and women's empowerment. Small loans would enable entrepreneurship, increase income, generate independence, particularly among women, who were the primary borrowers. If these women did not pay back, then their circle of friends with whom they had to be co-borrowers would carry the debt. Microfinance was so popular that in 2006, soon after I started working at the Indian Institute for Rural Development, writing reports on how World Bank financed loans changed the landscape of rural Rajasthan, Mohammed Yunus, the Bangladeshi founder of the best-known microfinance agency, Grameen Bank, would win the Nobel Peace Prize. In rural Rajasthan, someone somehow had identified naturally produced dyes as a potentially profitable industry, encouraging borrowers there to invest in this craft and rather than use these dyes themselves, export them for profit. But things rarely go as planned, which meant that natural dye production processes caused all these dermatological diseases among the rural population that microfinance was presumably lifting out of poverty. Back in Turkey, I contacted Deniz, who had offered that course in social anthropology some years ago. Deniz was trained as a sociologist and had written about migration and trade relations between ex-Soviet republics and Turkey, focusing particularly on shuttle trade, where people travel with a small amount of goods with the intention of selling them. Deniz was a junior scholar then, having finished her PhD in the US only 5 or 6 years before. Her first book had recently come out in Turkish. I don't want to be presumptuous, but I think Deniz was surprised that this random business school student had ended up becoming a development worker in rural Rajasthan, while my most successful classmates were on the corporate ladder at Procter & Gamble in Istanbul's Levant neighborhood. When I tried to relay some of my confusion, she shared a book that would help me process my experiences and asked me to review it for New Perspectives on Turkey, an Istanbul-based English language journal that she edited. Published in 2005, anthropologist Giulia Yaşar's Markets of Dispossession was set in Egypt rather than India, but the context it described was similar to the one I had observed in Jaipur. In my review of the book, which was published in 2006, I suggested that the book showed how the poor who were promised empowerment through micro-enterprise have been dispossessed of their social networks and, ironically, have continued to remain poor. Even though I had no training in anthropology, a mixture of arrogance and ignorance allowed me to assess the text and write, Yaşar claims that neoliberalism begins to contradict itself as it advances. This, in my opinion, is one of the strongest arguments of markets of dispossession. In the review, I even go ahead and presumptuously ask, however, what does this contradiction imply? Reading the review, Giulia Yaşar, whom I've come to know over the years, must have found all these questions from a young Gökçe so irritating and frustrating. By the time I returned to Istanbul from Jaipur, I was convinced that I had to become a researcher. Here it was, I'd finally discovered myself. I was observant, I had a good memory, I enjoyed writing, or perhaps I enjoyed having written. I also did not mind getting myself into uncomfortable situations, which could be an asset when carrying out ethnographic projects. For instance, in 2006, when interviewing a conservative member of the Turkish parliament who had started the Turkish branch of the Grameen Bank, I'd found myself amid a verbal and physical fight where the member of the parliament attacked a woman from his constituency for asking questions about an alleged corruption scandal. That same year, I'd also interviewed the then president of Koç University, asking him to describe how the university's new campus amid the northern forests of Istanbul had been designed and built, and how it formed relations with the neighborhood that surrounded it. Unfortunately, the voice recorder I brought with me had run out of battery, which meant that the president used the time reserved for the interview to lecture me on how to properly prepare for an interview instead. In late 2006, I submitted the book review I published in New Perspectives on Turkey as a writing sample and was somehow admitted to a PhD program in anthropology. In 2007, I traveled to the US for the first time. This is a photograph I sent my family soon after I arrived in Ithaca, explaining that this was my favorite place in town, mostly because I'd never been to a laundromat before. I hope you do know that Ithaca is geographically striking with gorges, waterfalls, and many families of deer. A graduate of American-style schools, I'd been packaged as an export commodity from Turkey, except for the name that no one could pronounce. Still, I was not prepared for the mix of isolation, competitiveness, and cold weather that awaited me at Cornell. Because I started keeping a list of all the books I was reading, I can tell you that in the fall of 2007, I read a total of 47 books. The list will expand to a total of 90 books at the end of the academic year. Many of the books I have on that list focus on classical debates in anthropology. Yet others demonstrate how, in the wake of the September 11 attacks, so many faculty and students at Cornell attempted to understand the links between modernity, Islam, and secularism. These conversations would shift with the Arab Spring in 2010 and Occupy Wall Street in 2011, allowing critical observers to instead focus on increasing levels of inequality worldwide. At Cornell, once again, I encountered the problem of self-knowledge. While everyone seemed to have such clearly delineated interests and well-structured research proposals, I was a leaf blowing in the wind towards 90 different directions. Perhaps I still carried all those qualities that I believed would one day make me a good researcher, but I was also indecisive. I detested introducing myself at seminars because I had no idea what to pinpoint as my research project. But I did remember how all those people I had met while learning about microfinance in Turkey had instructed me to travel to the United Arab Emirates to investigate financial transformations there. And soon here I was in Dubai, where not only gated communities, but whole cities were being built. The years 2007 and 2008 marked the peak of Dubai's building boom, a period when the city represented speculative real estate investment. Mixing a dose of envy with some obliviousness, English language media portrayed Dubai as a futuristic city rising out of the desert, a showcase of Gulf wealth and ambition. The boom also drew criticism. Newspapers reported on the plight of immigrant workers developing massive construction projects in backbreaking conditions. By late 2008, many argued that the real estate bubble that had propelled Dubai's expansion, enabling some of the city's more fantastical projects, such as the islands that made up the world map, I don't know if you remember that, had finally burst. In 2009, the media reported on white-collar workers abandoning their cars at the airport parking lot and leaving the city for good. Despite the financial breakdown, the people at Masdar City, which is not in Dubai but close by in Abu Dhabi, seemed open to telling me about their many projects. Masdar City had been master planned by the London-based architecture office, Fondren Partners, to rely entirely on renewable energy and clean technology. It would house 50,000 residents and 40,000 commuters on a 600-hectare area and cost $22 billion. According to plans, there would be a renewable energy and clean technology-focused research institute at Masdar City, sponsored by MIT. Many people told me that Masdar City was going to help prepare Abu Dhabi for a future with less oil and a Fondren Partners ending of the city. So this image that you see here circulated heavily in 2007 and 2008. I became very curious about the project. One book I read in those early years of the PhD program was Science and Technology Studies scholar Bruno Latour's Aramis, or The Love of Technology, which investigated why Aramis, an experimental automated transit system planned for Paris between 1960 and 1980, had failed. Surprisingly for me, many of the people I interviewed in Abu Dhabi asked me if I was trying to write an Aramis for Masdar City. Stylistically, Aramis is framed as a quasi-mystery or a detective novel, where two sociologists of technology try to understand how Aramis, the personal rapid transit system that was to be implemented in Paris, was killed. Eventually, they proposed that the technology failed not because any person involved in the project killed it per se, but rather because engineers could not adapt to changing social contexts. As a dedicated reader of literary spy novels and detective fiction, and most recently then Roberto Bolaño's 2666 and Savage Detectives, I was drawn to the idea of unpacking Masdar City in this manner. But quickly I came to understand how, in contrast to Latour's book, there was no solving of the crime in my project, but rather an investigation as to why people saw potential in building an eco-city in oil-rich Abu Dhabi. My main goal became an exploration of why and how people construct what they understand to be utopias. I was very happy when one reviewer responded to my dissertation proposal by saying wry humor animates this analysis of a spectacle in the making. While Aramis was significant to my fieldwork, I was mostly absorbed in Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, a modernist novel published in 1924 and set in a sanatorium in Switzerland in the years before World War I. In the book, a young German engineer, Hans Kastrop, visits his cousin for a short stay at the sanatorium, but somehow ends up living there for 7 years. The sanatorium serves as a microcosm of Europe, with patients from various ideological backgrounds drawn into discussions about all aspects of politics and society. In this insulated world, time feels detached from history. Still, the impending world war haunts the text, as debates in the sanatorium foreshadow the many conflicts that will soon consume the continent. That sanatorium depicted one more total institution, comparable in many ways to the dormitory in which I'd grown up, the gated communities I'd observed in Istanbul, and the master planned city project that I now studied. The Magic Mountain also gave me confidence that this yet-to-be-built city in Abu Dhabi, which news articles had written off as something fantastical, could perhaps say something simple but critical about energy, climate change, and urban design. The years after my PhD, when I was turning my dissertation into a book as a postdoc at Columbia University in New York City, were characterized by anxiety, and this felt different from the problem of self-knowledge, which I had carried with me for more than 15 years at this point and given up on resolving. In 2013, the authoritarian turn that my generation had been able to track in Turkey with the election of Erdogan as Istanbul's mayor in 1994, the devastating earthquake in 1999, and the various attacks on independent institutions throughout the 2000s had finally instigated mass protests. The Gezi movement began as a sit-in to prevent the construction of a shopping mall that would replace a small park at the center of Istanbul, but it quickly escalated into the largest wave of demonstrations in Turkey's recent history. In the wake of the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, people from all walks of life critiqued economic dispossession, urban transformation, and the dissolution of freedoms across the country. By now, my younger sister had finished college in Istanbul and was sharing with me all the gallows humor circulating among the protesters. It was strange to attend the demonstrations with friends in New York, both supporting the movement and feeling like I was not really part of it. The experience marked my transformation from a student into an immigrant. As we stood outside the Turkish consulate, I sensed how passers-by were wondering what again was happening in the Middle East. At the end, all people wanted to know was if these countries were safe for travel. In 2016, as my postdoc was coming to an end, a coup attempt provided a pretext for mass purges, a state of emergency, and further consolidation of power in Turkey. That same year, Donald Trump surprised many Americans by becoming the president of the US. While following these transformations, I was reading quite a bit of fiction, much of it autofiction. The genre had gained popularity after the publication of Norwegian novelist Karl Ove Knausgård's My Struggle, a 6-volume novel that narrates his life in detail. Still sharing an obsession with literature, Zeynep and I went to see Knausgård give a talk in New York in the spring of 2016. We also attended a rare Renata Adler reading in the Upper West Side and asked her to sign our copies of Speedboat. Originally published in 1976, the book was making a comeback. People around me discussed Ben Lerner's Leaving the Atocha Station and Rachel Cusk's Outline trilogy and drew connections between these texts and Sebald's moving books, Rings of Saturn, Austerlitz, Vertigo, and The Immigrants. For some authors, autofiction was a way to link personal experiences to collective historical shifts. For others, perhaps, it was what some described as a literary version of a selfie, detached, narcissistic, and apolitical. I couldn't grasp whether there was a connection between the dissolution of political institutions and the popularity of seemingly truthful books written in the first-person singular. In classes on the Middle East, however, I taught novels that described urban environments. Syrian novelist Khalid Khalifa's No Knives in the Kitchens of the City tracked the social, political, and spatial transformation of Aleppo throughout the 20th century. Ahmed Saadawi's Frankenstein in Baghdad, set in the aftermath of the US invasion of Iraq, centered on a junk dealer who collects scattered body parts with the intention of giving them a proper burial, but ends up creating a Frankenstein. Abduhad's Throwing Sparks was an allegory regarding extreme segregation in the context of Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. All these books were published and translated into English in the early 2010s and perhaps resonated with readers who had been following the Arab Spring. In their emphases, they also set a contrast to the autofiction that I constantly consumed. Luckily, this was also the period when the very immersive Elena Ferrante novels were translated into English, introducing readers to the deep friendship between two girls in Naples, Italy, and partially soothing the stress I felt while navigating the terrible academic job market. In those years, I couldn't help but wonder what my Procter & Gamble friends were doing. I'm sorry if I've overwhelmed you with many books already, but before I finish, I want to talk about one last novel, Austrian author Marlene Haushofer's The Wall. Published in 1963, The Wall describes an unnamed woman who goes to visit her family for a hunting trip in the Austrian Alps. One morning, she discovers that a transparent yet impenetrable wall has cut her off from all human contact. A dog called Lynx becomes her best and only friend and helps her adjust to this new unexpected life. By 2017, I'd been curious about many kinds of total institutions, ranging from dormitories to sanatoriums to master-planned cities. The Wall added a new layer to this mix of spaces, operating as a total institution with no human enforcers, only infrastructure. The narrative was fascinating to me, perhaps because in parallel to the ways that the dormitory allowed us to feel liberated from the oppressive world of adults, such spatial isolation empowered this narrator and her dog friend. Perhaps the book also foreshadowed the pandemic reality my husband Troy and I would experience in Houston in a few years' time, going through some months of isolation with the support of our dog, Laika. Okay, I've mostly managed to bring you all the way to the late 2010s, when Spaceship in the Desert was published. In the past decades, I worked on 2 new books which will be published in 2026. Floating Power, Energy Infrastructure and South-South Relations studies the emergence of a Turkish-built floating power plant in Ghana, analyzing how such inventive infrastructure shapes South-South relations and embodies broader imaginations of energy futures. Co-authored with my good friend and colleague Chika Watanabe, Patchwork Ethnography, a methodological guide, investigates how a researcher's personal life shapes the process of knowledge production. And these are fake covers that ChatGPT produced for me. Hopefully next time I give this talk, I'll start from the 2010s and with the gift of hindsight, tell you what I experienced and learned in this next phase of my life. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you.
I spent 2 years in a girls' boarding school, and that was more than enough for me. So I admire her 7 years in a boarding school, and the fact that it obviously was a very important experience for me. I'd say mine was probably 2, because it got me out of my home state of Louisiana and into an alien culture, which was Massachusetts. And I was really an outsider, very much an outsider, so I had that experience, yeah. And I personally am fascinated by your whole journey because you are an immigrant to this country at a time when the whole immigrant experience is under review, I'd say, under review. Anyway, she has kindly agreed to respond to questions. We do ask, where's Mary? At least we have asked in the past. She's right out there. And ask her questions into the mic. Are we recording, Mary? Yes. So we need you to ask your questions into the mic. Yes. Would someone like to start off with a question?
You can hear me without mic, I think.
Yes.
You got it for recording? Okay.
So I'm interested in the city with walls item you talked about, the gated communities, which is a segregated sort of lifestyle. I see that today with AirPods. I walk around Rice campus every morning. I say hello to people. There are so many people with shields around their heads, and they're not interacting. And have you all thought about what the impact of that might be on society and where it will take us?
That's a great question. Actually, this is exactly what we were talking about yesterday in my class that Selcan here can perhaps remember, because students were asking how relevant are fences and high walls in this day and age when people can just use digital technologies in order to shield themselves from whatever disaster they see as being forthcoming, right? So I think perhaps we could stretch that discussion to say that the AirPods serve a similar kind of purpose, creating a certain kind of isolation for the individual, even without the need for neighbors who are supporting you in that isolation, right? So I think that's a great analogy. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly where we could go from there. Perhaps the eyes are still available for commodification, and maybe the Google Glass type figure could generate isolation in that sphere as well.
I think I'm the only other Jewish person in the room. And it's really nice to see that, although there's a generation between us, there are 2 women in their childhood who read the same books. And my mom always tells me that since I read those books, that's why I wanted to become an anthropologist, because I wanted to just go around and have adventures. What do you think? I mean, my favorite book of that girl was the seaside one, the one where she was using, I think a boat maybe? I don't know. But can you just expand on how those childhood books affected you, and then you said that you're very comfortable with uncomfortable situations, which makes you a better anthropologist, which is something that I'm really bad at. But what do you think? Can you expand on like your childhood books and how they affected your sense of adventure?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think that's what I was trying to kind of communicate in the lecture too, that it wasn't necessarily you directly learning from the girl who's the character in the story and wanting to sort of replace her and become that girl, but it was more like being able to see the range of things in the world that are available to you. So it was, I think in that sense, it's a lot, my sense is that it's more about the production of a sort of like a more expansive imaginary world than the actual kind of seeing it as an instruction manual and try to go ahead and say, you know what, this girl went on this boat, let me also go and like take a boat trip. So I think that's the sensibility that I remember from that. And I didn't talk about this here, but one of the things that, you know, how there are all these like childhood stories that always repeat about your childhood, even though, you know, probably the people who were present in the room during that event have already kind of forgotten the actual event, but rely on their memories of telling the event. So they would say that I'd memorized many of these books, and I would just pretend to read the books whenever a guest came to our house, and so they would be like totally shocked that a 3-year-old is able to read so smoothly, even though I wasn't reading. I was just, you know, I was like all consumed in in having listened to them. So I don't know. I think it's like it's not really I don't think there's a causal relationship between, you know, reading adventure books and then becoming an adventurous person. But there is definitely something to say about, you know, expanding your horizons through seeing what's out there. Yeah.
You mentioned William Faulkner, and I'm probably not going to get this correct, but paraphrasing, he was asked something about the South, the past of the South, and its influence. And he said, the past is not even past. So in your various studies, how have you found the traces of the past influencing the present?
I mean, yeah, that's such a difficult question to answer, because I think we feel the presence of the past with us all the time. That I think you're right, the past isn't necessarily past. But I think one reason why it was so much easier for me to put together this talk about sort of the early years of my life is because when you have the distance from those years, then you can kind of perhaps smooth over some of the inconsistencies more easily and create a myth out of that time. That's why I'm able to just say the boarding school was wonderful, because all the things that was terrible about it I've already, you know, eliminated from my memory. So I think in that sense there is a kind of a process of, you know, creating more, you know, stabilized categories around the past that we all participate in. So now I've written this talk, I've created a sort of a more stable story around my, you know, let's say trajectory in literature, which is going to, you know, marginalize all the other books that didn't go into this story, even though they were perhaps equally important. So I think it's maybe more about, you know, trying to sort of understand how the past stays within the present. Because I think you're right, it's absolutely true that the past does stay with us, but maybe the ways in which it stays can be, you know, different depending on the situation.
So, yeah, this question actually kind of builds on Ginger's question. So I don't really know anything about Middle Eastern history, but we've been to Morocco and Istanbul, and I noticed that when you talked about walled cities or walled gated communities, it's just, I suddenly remembered that in Morocco and Istanbul and the Medinas, they're walled communities.
and that was in the Middle Ages, in the 1500s, 1400s. So how are the walled cities of today different from that, or is it just the same history being repeated again, that people trying to keep other people in, and the people they want inside, and people they don't want outside?
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing research on Masdar City specifically, one of the things that people kept telling me was that they were just, making a version of the older cities in the Middle East. So one of the examples they always referred to was a city in Yemen called Shibam, which is a walled city that still exists. And they thought that we can sort of rebuild this city, but add technology to it and make it, more 21st century in some ways. So I think the references that you're drawing were definitely present in the construction of Masdar City. With the gated communities too, maybe there were some references like that people use. I'm not really familiar, but maybe one thing that they all share is this kind of the production of an outside threat, and the belief that the best way to protect yourself from an outside threat is to build walls. So yesterday in my class, when we were talking about this, we were wondering what the time horizon for those kinds of protections might be. So if you're building the wall, is the wall there to stay in order to sort of actually be the mode in which you create security for yourself and for the future generations, for the conceivable future, or is it seen as a sort of a temporary fix that's going to lead to a sort of a better society that will allow people to get rid of walls altogether? So it's a curious question, I think, and maybe people have asked that same question in different contexts throughout history.
I'd like to ask a question. I was interested that, everything I know about Mohammed Yunus in the past until tonight has been positive. That he did a lot for women, empowerment, microenterprise, loaning money. They had a huge rate of return, much higher than the regular banks, and brought these groups of women out of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. But tonight you're saying there's been a lot of criticism now of that program. And that brings to my mind USAID, which has worked for so many years and so many programs on economic development. Now, it has received over the years criticism for a lot of things. But it also has been responsible for some very good things, like bringing potable water to towns. So I'm wondering, anytime someone tries to do something good, economically good, or it seems like it gets a lot of criticism. And do you have any thoughts about that? Is it an inevitable part of trying to do good?
I mean, you're basically asking, can development projects actually work?
There have been so many people investigating that and asking about that and wondering what it is. And I think one sort of emotional reaction that I'm noticing amongst my friends and colleagues now in the US in the aftermath of the dissolution of USAID is how disappointed they are at that dissolution. So even though many people criticize those development projects, but I think they were also quite attached to the ways in which they changed the world and the way they changed not only the places where they happened, but the ways they changed the US itself. So I think, yes, they are bound to have criticism because they act sometimes without a very good knowledge of the context in which they're operating. Sometimes there's a way in which they get photocopied from one place to the next. Because they worked in one place, they're expected to do the same job in the other location. And sometimes that's not really helpful for the new context, let's say. So I think it's only natural that they draw criticism. But I don't know if there's any way in which there can be a world where there is no friction between these kinds of desires, like the intentions to do good versus the intention to also just, let's say, preserve a way of life or preserve the kinds of, a certain kind of human dignity, etc. Yeah, I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, because I think this would deserve a whole class on anthropology of development, yes.
Thank you very much. Maybe one last question?
Can I ask, many times when people talk about reading, they don't often talk about co-reading. And I'm struck by the fact that being an academic is very much about being a co-reader, and yet we very rarely talk about that as an experience. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit about what are the co-reading experiences you have, if you could say that about the conversations that emerge, and what is the texture of the co-reading that you love to do?
I'm so glad that you asked me that, because when I first got the invitation to do this talk, that was my first reaction, was to say that it has to have some kind of layer of co-reading, to sort of actually show reading as a social activity rather than a kind of a, solitary one, which is often how it's depicted. It's almost, very often it's about a conversation between a reader and the author. But in fact, as people who teach seminars, we all know that it's actually what's most fascinating about books is that they create conversations between all of us in a classroom, between our students and between us as colleagues. So I was really interested in bringing that into the talk. So thank you for asking about that. And I think, well, the one thing, I think I was very lucky to have sort of friends and roommates in this particular situation who had a similar kinds of interests, and we could cultivate those interests together and maintain our relationships through those interests, even though we don't live in the same places, and being able to sort of share this almost like a 30-year-long syllabus with a friend is an invaluable gift for me. So it's like, and it's like, I think also, I don't know how to describe the texture of it necessarily, but I think it also always tells you that there's a future to that relationship, because there's always going to be one more book to read. And in that sense, I think it makes the relationships more both lively and secure too. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's so different based on the, who it's with.
All right, thank you all. We wanted to give you one of our patented umbrellas. Thank you so much for this talk. It was amazing. All right, I have about 6 hours left on this mic, so tonight's lecture is presented by Friends of Fondren Library. The Friends is an organization that fundraises and supports the Fondren Library. We present lectures and events for members and for the Greater Houston community. If you're not already a member, please consider this your call to action. Please join us. Fondren touches every single person on this campus and many in this community. Whether you're in the North Colleges or the South Colleges, whether you're in the marching out band or an athlete or in our theater, every single person goes through this place. And if Fondren has touched you, I encourage you now to pull out your phone and join. We hope you all will join us for future Friends of Fondren events. Our next event is sold out, but it's next Wednesday. And it's our annual meeting featuring Rice University Chairman of the Board, Robert Ladd. Friends members receive advance notices of these events. So that's another reason for you guys to sign up if you haven't already. Thank you all for attending tonight. Please join us for a reception down the hall in the Brown Fine Arts Library. You'll notice that the space has recently been remodeled thanks to support from the Friends of Fondren Library. Thank you all.